When I was asked to do this talk, it was suggested that I might talk about heavy metal mines, and I thought, well, no, it's not a good idea. That's been published. If you want to read about it, it's in the Fourth National Institute Historian, and it's also available, or aspects of it, online i- okay, um, in other sources. So there's quite a lot there. There is very little for this. Now, of course, there's a great deal about the local coal industry and the Scottish coal industry post 1750, when the whole thing becomes a mega part of the economy. But for the earlier period, um, there is a great deal less. So my talk will very much be based on documentary evidence. It's not based on fieldwork. I don't claim to have done any, though there are, of course, people who have looked at aspects of this. And as I say, there's been a great deal published about the later industry. So I'm not looking at antiquity, and I recognise that coal working may well go back into antiquity, nor at the modern period. Um, so, and I'm going to confine it more or less to the fourth catchment. I'm not going to look at the coal mining sites which I know were there, for example, in far west of Stirlingshire, Kilsyth, Campsie, and places like that. Oh.
You just click on the mouse, it should move on.
Click.
I think if you just...
I tried right click. Oh, there we are.
Left clicking.
Left clicking. Oh, right. Okay. Now, just to emphasize, sort of look at the later period, we're all aware that there was this great wave of the coal mining, the importance of the industrial coal mining that swept across Scotland between the mid-18th century and the modern period. And of course, we all know, most of us lived through the termination of that massive industry. And we know that there were political, environmental, economic, demographic, and cultural impacts there. And as I say, really, so the question then is, do you get those sorts of impacts at the beginning? Clearly, they'd be smaller scale, but we should expect them to be there. In general, the scope of the talk, I'm going to try and look at a number of different subheadings. I've got a very brief introduction, some of the absolutely basic things about coal that we need to bear in mind that have limited its use in the past in many cases, the locations, more or less, of the coal mining in the period I'm talking about, the markets of those coal minings, those coal mines, the technologies that they were using and how they changed, and the labour force. And I'm sorry, I realised a lot of subheadings, and that necessarily means that the talk is going to be to some extent a bit bitty. There'll be a bit about this and a bit about that, but I'd rather that. There's no great thesis that drives the whole thing forward. A very important point here, and I'm sorry we're losing a bit to the strip at the top, but I gather I can't do anything about that at this end. Wood was too important to burn for most people for many hundreds of years. Or at least it would be burned. It's the obvious fuel. It's what people think. Oh, and I remember a book about the life of Mary Queen of Scots, which said at Linlithgow Palace in 1543, the great log fires burned. 42, sorry. The great log fires blazed in the grate. They didn't. They were coal fires in all the royal palaces. It comes as a kind of stereotype to us. We think that's what it ought to have been. But as Susan was just saying earlier, you get a lot more heat in a cartload of coal than you do in a cartload of or indeed of peat. But timber, burnable fuel timber was scarce, certainly by the 15th century, perhaps earlier, such that it's being imported major building work. and it was a relatively treeless landscape in the 17th century. Travellers comment on you needed some wood for vernacular buildings of the type you see bottom right, and for that reason the trees were conserved to some extent. The other, but it's not a major fuel. Peat, of course, again, maybe a sort of stereotypical idea of what people would use for fuel. By and large, it was very widely distributed across Scotland, variable quality, but widely distributed. So it's likely to be reasonably close to hand. On the other hand, a lot of work, it has to be cut, it has to be carried. And you see the instance here of a woman in St Ninians in 1668 carrying peats on the Sabbath. She's sort of excused because she's poor, been ill for a long time and lacks fuel. So it was very important indeed. And I'll talk about some of the other advantages of it in just a moment. And one for which I have no documentary evidence is cow dung, but I'm quite sure that it was being used. But typically, because of the way that you would gather it, you'd go out, you bring some home, probably in a basket, and you dry it as little patches. As you'll see, if you go to the Middle East, the Far East, you'll still see it today, and cow dung drying on the walls of the houses for use as fuel. But it's, generally speaking, not documented, and I'm dependent on the documents. Coal, there are various problems connected with it. First of all, it tends to be remote. And that really matters. Looking at coal coming into Stirling in the later 17th century, the prices are there. Coal, which at the pit head in the 1670s cost £3, costs £5 by the time it gets to Stirling. To Stirling. So think of Gargunnock, think of Kippen. The price is leaping up. Coal is almost always a part of the cash economy, whereas peat, perhaps wood, certainly cow dung, would be part of a quite different economy. You do a lot of the work yourself. Very importantly, coal requires an iron fire basket, which will raise it up and allow a draft from below, the old fire grate. And that's expensive in itself, and it requires a flue to remove the smoke, which is much more irritating than peat or wood smoke. I mean, they drifted around the houses and people just had to put up with it. But having coal smoke drifting around the house would not be so good. So all of these have limited the use of coal in earlier periods. The coal was there, but using it was another matter. And certainly in medieval and earlier times, one would expect it, I think, to be probably largely confined to elite houses and special uses, particularly for industry. So the documentation really starts to kick in this area from the 14th century. In Christmas 1338, coal was being supplied for use in Stirling Castle. 1365, 85 tons of coal from Bannockburn or Skeoch, which is a part of or near to Bannockburn, for the royal household. And again, also there is documentary evidence of its use for blacksmithing, for the burning of lime for the construction industry, and of course it was also being used for boiling salt. It's rather interesting. This is an extract from the first edition OS of the Bannockburn house area. You see it here. But look at the coal pits. There are 3 coal pits. Even in that. So I think that the explanation here is they were not all working at the same time. Some of them may have been fairly transient. But there were certainly a great many. And I think that this would apply to all the other sites. I think that many of these coal mines didn't operate for a terribly long time. what is apparent is that during the course of the 16th century, use of coal and exploitation, the mining, begin to increase, and it becomes a matter of note for the Scottish Parliament, for example. In 1544, as a report on the harbours, because shipping of coal, it's largely to do with coal, shipping of coal is becoming more important. At one stage, there was legislation. It was theoretically applied for probably throughout the second half of the 16th century, banning the export of coal. But then they would say, well, it's banned, but we'll give you a license for a fee, so you can. But the reason for the nominal ban was a fear that if it was major exports, the coal would run out. Isn't that an interesting idea? And so you start getting these licenses being issued to people to export coal, certainly documented surviving from the late 16th century. You see 1596, one for Bruce of Airth to export. By 1614, Airth is exporting several thousand tons per year. I mean, it's substantial. Over quite a period of time, and there was a harbour for the coal. And coal accounts by the late 16th, early 17th century for a very substantial part of the customs duties on goods being moved up and down and across the Forth. Some of that coal is being exported, going to the Netherlands, to England, but some is also going more locally. And a great deal of it is being used in boiling salt. So it's very important for the mines which were close to the riverbank. If you're several miles from the riverbank, then you don't have that option. Right. If these dots look a bit variable, that indicates my incompetence at map drawing. Nothing to do with any variability of the coal mines or any measurable variation between them. I think that this is most of the ones that are documented. You'll see there really are quite a lot, and in some cases there are 2 or 3 close together, which won't be represented on this map. But so there are quite a lot, and several of them are quite close to the river, and were certainly engaged in exporting coal. So the coastal ones have this advantage, and they particularly used what was called the small coal for salt boiling. It's sometimes also called pan wood, salt pan wood. There was extensive and increasing Scottish markets, particularly in the towns. There are architectural implications in that, which don't have time to go into, but very important. And also from the mid-17th century, in this area, you're starting to get coal being used for the burning of agricultural lime, as well as for construction industry lime. The great coals, which would be large blocks, were favoured particularly for export, and there's really quite a lot of information, particularly between the 1670s and the 1690s, in the correspondence between merchants in Stirling and elsewhere, but particularly from Stirling, and Andrew Russell, factor in Rotterdam, who Chris Smith has written about, but he didn't give you all the detail. There was a great deal of information about that, and it was very important. Stirling merchants investing in shipping coal out, particularly from Alloa, to go to the Netherlands, and then they re-import luxury goods and manufactured goods to pay for that. So if you were away from the shoreline, that is a trickier option, and the Bannockburn or Auchenbarry ones would, for example, even could find that problematic. Special arrangements had to be made in the early 17th century. I think it's from the 1630s. Stockheath, a mile or two inland compared to Alloa Harbour, and that they enter into a special arrangement with the Alloa landowners to transport their coal across the Alloa estate, and they resent that for 150 years. I mean, these things, you know, have their own story. This is a lime kiln which will almost certainly near North Third. Outside Stirling, almost certainly been used coal. So if you're the fortunate landowner who finds coal on the land and is exploiting it and it's successful, you may well, the most obvious thing that people do is to invest in new houses. And here are a number of examples where they appear to have done so. There's a nice story from Airth. It's told in the 18th century how the young lad was fighting overseas as a mercenary soldier, and his mother holding the fort, and she uses the profits of the small coals in order to extend and modernize the house, and he was rather ungrateful when he came back, obviously thinking that she should have, well, we all think that other people should have done other things, she should have invested in land. Now, there certainly is an argument that people should have invested in farming rather than in luxury houses, but they seem to have invested in luxury houses, which are, many of which, of course, are really now rather nice and important heritage artifacts. Now, so Bannockburn Sciorc is one of the better documented ones. Sciorc is a large, some of you will know a site called Sciorc, but the Sciorc actually extends right up above Bannockburn village. It includes halfway out to Plean, indeed, in Bannockburn. It was a royal estate, and the coal was up there on the higher part of Sciorc, not near the modern site. So it's quite well documented because it was part of the royal estate, particularly in the 16th and 17th century. There's quite a number of records there. And again, they show this intermittency. When Mary de Guise and Mary Queen of Scots moved into Stirling Castle in 1543, they had to have coal shipped in from Alloa because it wasn't available from Sciorc as it should have been. So this, the importance of the supply of coal in Stirling, and it's really, I think, the default fuel in Stirling by the later 16th century. The contract here in the 1560s for the supply and the terms, and that has implications. These paths are designed for use with coal. You know, so it has an impact on architecture that wouldn't perhaps immediately spring to mind. At the actual sites, there must have been the ones on the river, as I say, most of them were making salt, and that was a major use. And they may have been even further upstream earlier on than they were later, if they were using peat. But the coal-fired ones include Saltcoats. Notice the significant name that's now under the Grangemouth oil refinery. Airth, Elphinstone, which we now usually call Dunmore, and Kennet Pans, amongst others. And very significantly, here's Elphinstone Pans, Dunmore, and the coal gate side. The coal gate is the track that you use to bring the coal from the mine to the pans and the harbour, which was also here. And there were quite a number of those. A gate, of course, is a road in 17th century Scots. As the industry develops, there's an increasing emphasis on various forms of new technology. Gins or winding gear were very important. I'll mention windmills, which might surprise many of you. Water wheels, which are better known, fire engines, that's steam engines, canals, rivers, roads, for example, tremendously important, and harbours and ships. And when you sort of think, oh gosh, you see, this is not a new technology, but the expansion of carts in the late 17th century and early 18th century was tremendously important, so much more efficient than the sleds and sledges which have been used previously. The gins and various other winding systems were really quite widespread by the late 17th century. They're particularly well documented at Elphinstone. In fact, that's the best documented of these mines. So a horse mill and in connection with the coal in 1655, the gin of Alloa in 1671, the gin Hugh called the coal gate. It brings it all together, so there's lots of records of this sort of thing, and the rather sketchy little map here. But this is the gin of Clackmannan. The best known example of a new tech was, of course, the Gartmore Dam, which many of you will be familiar with, used as a power source for the machinery for the Alloa and adjacent mines. But that comes from the 1710s. But the one I want to emphasise, because it's rather novel, is the windmill at Dunmore, Elphinstone, and this is documented because there are accounts for this coal mine, intermittently at least, in the mid to late 17th century, making 6 sails to the windmill. It seems to have required quite a lot of maintenance, and which from our point of view is good, because that means records. You think windmills, what do you want? You would always prefer water power. You can store water, you can manage it much more readily, and you get more energy in a limited area. But in the Dunmore Elphinstone area, it's so flat the streams wouldn't have had sufficient energy to generate the force that would be required for the task in hand. So, as in the Netherlands or East Anglia, other flat areas, you have windmills. At the Thane, it's the little wind vane that makes it turn to the wind. Right. Again, there's documentation, and this very interesting, rather early record from 1723, a salt pans, a coal mine with a fire engine. That's a steam engine. Must have been one of the very first in Scotland. They've been invented. There's been a new common type. They've been invented in the late 17th century, so they're leaping on to the new tech fairly quickly. Also very important were changes, nothing directly to do with the mines, but between particularly during the 1670s and into the early 1680s, there was a major road improvement program in this area. Now, this may not look like a major road improvement to you, but it did if you wanted to get from Stirling to Gargunnock in 1673. That's at Lecky, that little bridge. I'm very pleased Historic Scotland are persuaded them to repointed a few years ago. But that is a genuine 1673 bridge, documented at the time and got a date stone on it, so it's firmly dated. But it was one of many others scattered across the area. Things like the railways and so on came somewhat later in this area, not until the 1670s, according to Murray Dickey's excellent work. But simply having better road surfaces and more bridges would facilitate the whole business of moving coal about the area. But still, I think the far west Stirlingshire, the ones furthest away from the coal mines, that don't get coal until the late 18th century. Tariffs were being levied on the coal, I think I mentioned this before, from Socky going to Alloa Harbour, and resented for 150 years. So, labour force, very importantly, most of the workers were a form of serfdom or indentured labour. They were obliged to continue working for life in the mine. They were not free to leave, and if they did so, they could be forcibly returned. They were paid, and compared with other people, not badly paid. There was contention. We'll come to that in a moment. The children could inherit their father's servile status, and the women of the family, the daughters and wives, acted as the bearers, carrying the coal up from the pit, and they are doing a lot of the work at the pit head. And there are real records of this, colliers being forcibly returned. Again, one at Elphinstone, 1655, brought back from Glasgow by horse. And one at Kempsey, where a collier, and the contract actually survives for this guy, binding himself for life to work in the coal mine. In 1694, 16 miners, and so you're getting numbers in these cases. You begin to get an idea of the scale of the industry. Are paid that they owe money to the mine owner, because the mine owners pay them in meal, which they give them in advance, and they're perpetually in debt to the mine owner. It's the old St. Peter, don't you call me, because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. A truck system, they were called, and this was universal, probably. But here you're actually seeing an example of how it could work, how they are in debt to their employers. The accounts also show that the women, I'm surprised the differential between the men and the women isn't more, to be quite frank. The women were certainly doing some pretty hard work.
John, we started a little bit late, so 2 minutes, 2-minute warning.
Okay, right. Okay, well, I'll see what I can do. So there are disputes about that, inevitably. I think we'll perhaps have to skip that one. Yes. This one we can't skip. At Alva, two guys have been seen to be drunk. They were two graceless, profane persons. They were colliers, who are a rude and ungovernable kind of people, refractory to all good order, for the most part profligate in their conversation. And another smasher, a man in Tillicoultry, accused of a miner, accused of beating his wife. The great cause is his wife would not bear up his coals from the Hurka she'd formerly done, and she says he doesn't give her wages, and that's why. It's what a vivid glimpse of the life going on here. You get some hints of numbers here, and numbers again. St Ninians, 70 of 279 subscribers are colliers, 17 65 households in Bannockburn, 10 correspond to names of miners on the Mort's lost list. In 1702, the Bannockburn miners went on strike. There were 46 people, including there were 22 coal hewers, 46 people, including the bearer. So this, when you look at the number of mines that there were, you're talking about many hundreds of people across the area. These people they're sent to prison until they agree to go back to work. This is them signing their names. Some of them making more or less marks, but Edward Hall, a very clear, modern sort of signature. I think we've had that, so we just keep moving. By the 1650s, 1660s, people are beginning to say, we no longer use coal. John Pearson, 16 years past, had not made use of peats, but of coal for his family. The world is changing. The others, all these people are tenant farmers, and they use coal as cheap as peats and easy to come by. They only use peats to dry grain. The trouble makes it dear. That's the thing. People realize the value of their own work. Used for drying grain now. So I think the world has changed. These people are commenting on a new world where the great wave is beginning to form and coal will dominate life for the future. It's a cash economy and it has all sorts of impacts, including, for example, in the architecture of the houses.